Faith and sexuality remain one of the most debated issues in American Christianity. As society grows more inclusive of LGBTQ+ people, many Christians question what the Bible truly says about homosexuality and same-sex relationships. In the US, where about 65% of adults identify as Christian, public opinion on LGBTQ+ rights has shifted dramatically over the past 2 decades. Understanding biblical perspectives on homosexuality requires careful examination of ancient texts, historical context, and the evolution of biblical interpretation. This analysis aims to present various scholarly viewpoints and interpretative approaches without advocating for any particular theological position, recognizing that sincere Christians can and do reach different conclusions on these matters. Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. The book of Leviticus contains 2 passages that are frequently cited in discussions about homosexuality. Leviticus 18:22 states that a man shall not lie with another man as with a woman, calling it an abomination. Similarly, Leviticus 20:13 prescribes severe punishment for such acts. Traditional conservative interpretations view these verses as clear biblical prohibitions against all forms of homosexual activity. This perspective emphasizes the plain meaning of the text and argues that God's moral standards are unchanging across time and culture. However, progressive scholars and theologians offer several alternative interpretations. Some argue that these laws were specifically given to ancient Israel as part of their holiness code to distinguish them from surrounding pagan cultures. They point out that these same chapters contain numerous other prohibitions that most modern Christians no longer observe, such as restrictions on eating shellfish, wearing mixed fabrics, or planting different crops in the same field. Another interpretation suggests that the Levitical passages address specific practices common in ancient Near Eastern religions, such as temple prostitution or ritual sexual acts associated with idol worship. Linguistic scholars also debate the meaning of the Hebrew word toeva, translated as abomination. Some argue that this term often refers to ritual impurity or cultural taboos, rather than inherent moral evil. They note that the same word is used to describe eating practices that are culturally unacceptable, but not necessarily sinful in all contexts. Romans 1:26-27. The Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans contains what many consider the most explicit New Testament passage addressing same-sex relations. In Romans 1:26-27, Paul describes both female and male same-sex relations as contrary to nature and the result of exchanging the truth of God for a lie. Conservative interpretations see this passage as Paul's clearest condemnation of homosexual behavior. They argue that Paul describes same-sex relations as contrary to God's created order and natural design. They emphasize that Paul addresses both male and female same-sex relations, indicating a comprehensive prohibition. Progressive interpretations offer several counter-arguments. Some scholars argue that Paul is specifically addressing the Roman practice of sexual excess and exploitation. They suggest that Paul is condemning the abandonment of natural sexual relations for unnatural ones in the context of religious orgies and temple prostitution. Others focus on Paul's use of the word natural, arguing that Paul was reflecting the cultural understanding of his time, rather than establishing universal moral principles. They point out that Paul uses similar language about women's hair covering and other practices. Some scholars also interpret this passage within the broader context of Romans 1, which describes the consequences of idolatry and turning away from God. They argue that Paul is not primarily concerned with sexual ethics, but is using sexual behavior as an example of the broader human condition of rebellion against God.